Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Historical Fiction? Texts in the Han. Some people enjoy reading on phones and tablets, while others prefer print versions, including the feel of books in their hands. Of course, the most discerning prefer listening to podcasts. But as philosophers, we can't get around dealing with texts. In our Warring States and Qin episodes, we've duly referred to texts as our primary sources. But why don't we just call them books? There are many reasons, some of which we've already come across. We normally expect a book to have some themes and threads cogently woven together and some internal structural coherence. We expect authors to map out what they want to say and to set this up across paragraphs, sections, and chapters. Texts such as the Mengzi and the Shuangzi do have sections and chapters, but those could well have been organized in book form at a later point in time. Furthermore, it's often difficult, if not impossible, to detect overarching themes and grand visions, even if interpreters sometimes claim otherwise. In fact, we often find outright inconsistencies, as in the Han Feizi. Texts from before the Han period also preserve hints that they originated in an oral culture. Sources as diverse as the Analects, Mozi, Mengzi, and Shuangzi include dialogues and conversations. Perhaps these texts, or sections of them, are written versions of direct speech and orally transmitted ideas. Moreover, with most if not all Warring States texts, it's not merely that authorship is uncertain. It often seems that the sections of one text were written in different time periods. The received Analects, organized in 20 chapters without any obvious thematic coherence, can hardly be treated as a systematic compilation, much less a book. Prior to the Han, as well as into the Western Han, we can hardly speak of books as stable, authorized, final works. There were texts that circulated in several versions, as confirmed by excavated texts. For example, the Guojian versions of the Lao Tzu, Lao Tzu A, B, and C, differ slightly from the received text, sometimes in subtle and philosophically important ways. Or think of the triads of the Mozi, with 3 versions of each chapter. We might wonder whether these are simply alternative recensions collected and published together. The Analects, too, seems to have existed in 3 dominant versions early in the Han dynasty. Scholars during the Han were accustomed to work with these unstable texts, elaborating on them in significant commentaries. They edited the texts, quoted from them, placed them into traditions or schools, and sometimes associated them with authoritative figures. Elaboration on texts, which we call commentaries, involved making annotations on how specific passages or words in a text should be understood. Here's an example of a commentary on a passage in the Lao Tzu that refers to Dao. The opening part of Lao Tzu 14 says, "We look at it and do not see it. Its name is the invisible. We listen to it and do not hear it. Its name is the inaudible. We touch it and do not find it. Its name is the subtle. These 3 cannot be further inquired into and hence merge into one." The commentary on these statements explains how we can understand Tao. Because Tao has no shape, no form, no sound, and no echo, there is nothing it cannot penetrate and nowhere it cannot go. It cannot be known. Furthermore, I do not know its name by my ears, eyes, or body. Therefore, they cannot further be inquired into and hence merge into one. This commentary was provided by Wang Bi, born just after the end of the Han period. His commentaries on the I Ching and the Lao Tzu have been and continue to be immensely influential. The annotations of Wang Bi give us some idea of how Han thinkers interpreted texts of an earlier period, which often meant reading them in light of their own socio-political circumstances. This practice of writing commentaries already began in the late Warring States period. Commentaries served to highlight important ideas in a passage or a text, and in doing so elevated the status of those texts. The word classic, or jing, as in Dao De Jing, came to denote important works as classics. However, we shouldn't assume that from the Han period, thinkers worked with a more or less definitive version of a text, and that the contributions of Han thinkers lay only in their different commentaries. Rather, commentators often re-edited the text they were commenting on. it seems that Wang Bi's commentary on the Lao Tzu is based on an earlier version of the Lao Tzu known as the He Xiang Gong version. But that version is lost, and the Lao Tzu text you'd most likely be reading today is yet another recension. Nor were the scholars conservative in their approach, happy just to transmit what they found in their manuscripts with an occasional minor adjustment. Remember how the post-Han thinker Gou Jiang edited the existing 52-chapter Shuangzi to produce a reduced 33-chapter text, and also provided the most influential commentary on it. Beyond their interpretive work on the text, the Han thinkers also shaped the textual culture. This too has had a lasting impact on the understanding of Chinese philosophy. Prominent Han thinkers were a kind of imperial brain trust, and some were tasked with collating the vast body of texts inherited from the past as part of the empire's consolidation of power. These projects contributed to state-sponsored orthodoxy, as we've already seen with works that explicitly blame the Qin Empire for its own downfall. But how should an official tasked with this project catalog the texts? Might they, like a librarian, organize books according to their subject matter, topic, author, and date, for example? Nowadays, many libraries use the Dewey Decimal System, according to which there are 10 main classes running from 000 to 999. We're glad to report that philosophy belongs under the 100 heading. This makes our subject almost as fundamental as computer science and information, which comes first under the 000 heading, an unsurprising choice coming from information specialists. As this shows, no classification of knowledge is neutral, and the cataloging efforts of the Han thinkers reveal the same thing. We've already come across Sima Tan's classification in the Records of the Grand Historian of then existing views into 6 schools: Yin-Yang, Confucians, Mohists, Dialecticians, Fa thinkers, and Taoists. In addition to the inconsistency of these categories, with some centering on a key idea and others on an alleged founder, the classification simply presumes that there were schools, something we've often had occasion to question. What we want to emphasize for present purposes is that this very idea was the product of Han period attempts to systematize the earlier materials. Sima Tan was seeking to impose intellectual coherence upon a chaotic body of materials so as to get it under some degree of control. Another historian, Ban Gu, preserves an important bibliographical catalog titled Treatise on Arts and Letters, or Yi Wen Ci. Ban Gu makes it one of the 10 treatises that comprise his own Book of Han. The catalog draws heavily from earlier works that are now lost, the separate listings and 7 summaries overseen by Lu Jiang and his son Yu Qin. Much of Ban Gu's Treatise on Arts and Letters reproduces these bibliographic records, placing the text under 6 categories: the 6 arts, masters, poetic compositions, military writings, algorithmic and technical texts, and medical recipes and techniques. Each category is split into further subdivisions. Under the masters category, which lists sets of texts associated with leading figures, there are 10 subdivisions. They include the 6 schools listed in the Records of the Grand Historian, with an additional 4, the strategists, syncretists, agriculturalists, and folklorists. Although the bibliographical treatise takes a large amount of material from Liu Xiang's 7 summaries, and in doing so inherits the problems of this and other bibliographic works, it is the earliest and most comprehensive bibliographic record from the Chinese tradition. Thinking about this catalog prompts us to consider 2 fundamental questions. The first concerns how texts are categorized. Why 6 categories divided in just this way? Do the 6 categories carry equal weight? Secondly, digging further back, what was the nature and condition of the text being categorized? By Ban Gu's day, these would already be centuries old, having been transmitted through the Qin period from earlier times. Let's discuss these 2 questions in turn. The opening paragraph of the treatise says that after the death of Kong Tzu, here called Song Ni, his words ceased to be known, and after his 70 disciples passed away, their fundamental practices and teachings were distorted. This is followed by a very brief summary of the decline over the Warring States period, when thinkers became confused. Then came the Qin dynasty, during which books were burnt with malicious intent in order to deceive the common people. When the Han took power, it corrected the failures of the Qin. It began a major enterprise of collecting texts and records, energetically facilitating ways for books to be presented. Therefore, Although the treatise begins on a gloomy note with the death of Kongzi, followed by society's gradual decline, that paves the way for initiatives taken by the Han emperors. Several important tasks are achieved in this short introduction to the treatise. It provides justification for the Han Empire's project of consolidating texts, and juxtaposes this noble enterprise with the maleficence of the Qin. It also spells out the intention of the state to ground itself in an extensive knowledge base, so as to inform enlightened government. And of course, it confers legitimacy on the project of the bibliographical treatise itself. The treatise implicitly presents itself as preserving the canon. In its categorization of texts, it places particular weight on the 6 classics, that is, the I Ching, the Book of History, Book of Odes, Record of Rituals, Record of Music, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. The Record of Music was subsequently dropped from this list, with the remaining 5 forming the 5 Confucian classics. The 6 classics may indeed be described as canonical, insofar as thinkers during the Han quoted extensively from them. And these 6 classics are given an elevated place in the treatise. Under its first category, the 6 arts, each classic is allocated a specific section. Under the second category, the writings of the masters are presented as derivative. They're considered the branches and currents of the 6 classics. Notwithstanding these gestures towards systematicity, the treatise's handling of the text is uneven. Under the last 2 categories, technical texts and medical recipes, details of authors' dates and annotations are omitted. So, the treatise should not be read as a disinterested source of information on Han and pre-Han writings. Rather, it is an ideological project for selecting and ordering texts that together dictate the core rationale for the political and administrative affairs of the state. The treatise and other scholarly productions of the Han effectively construct and entrench the canon that undergirds the empire and its approach. The representation of available texts is heavily weighted toward the Confucian tradition, with Kongzi appearing as the authoritative and paradigmatic moral teacher. Meanwhile, of course, the canon was being further cemented in the imperial examination system. This makes thinkers such as Liu Xiang and Ban Gu gatekeepers of the literary heritage of the Han, or, as a scholar of our own day, Michael Hunter, puts it, knowledge systematizers. The categorization of texts must surely be seen as an empire-building project, with lasting impacts right up to the present. Let's move on to our second question. What kinds of texts were Liu Xiang and his collaborators looking at? Their task would have been daunting, to put it mildly. At least some of the texts they handled would lack any indication of author or school affiliation. Most texts had no titles, though a few did have titles written on the back end of a bundle of bamboo slips. They might even lack identifiable and coherent themes. Scholar Martin Kern describes what Liu Xiang might have faced. The salaried Western Han court classicists had to create new, normalized texts out of numerous bundles of bamboo slips that more often than not were in considerable disarray, or in competing and divergent orthography. Han scholars like Liu Xiang literally wrote their own imperial versions of the earlier texts by making orthographic and lexical choices, but also, even more fundamentally, by deciding which writings were to be included under a specific title, that is, as a book. So, when you go into a modern bookstore and pluck a copy of the Analects or the Shuangzi off the shelf, you're inheriting the legacy of Han period scholars. The aura surrounding certain classics or masters is a retrospective construction that came generations after the texts were written, and the momentum of this process greatly increased during the Han. Of course, this very podcast series is itself a distant echo of that same process. In covering Warring States thought, we started the only place we could. The grouping of Confucians, Moists, Taoists, legalists, and their texts is our intellectual heritage from the Han. But now, knowing a bit more, we should be more tentative about texts and intellectual traditions in early China. Here's one example. As we already mentioned, in the Treatise of Arts and Letters, there are 10 types of bibliographical works listed under the Masters category. One of them is the syncretists, people who expounded miscellaneous, unclassified views, or who mixed different sets of teachings, as by fusing Confucian and Moist ideas. Anytime you make a list, you may be tempted to include a heading like this, for miscellaneous items that don't belong anywhere else in the other categories. It's the flip side of being systematic. you wind up having to list things that don't quite fit into the system. Indeed, the very term syncretist arises precisely from the expectation that texts and authors should fit within the recognized schools of thought. And if the schools of thought and their masters were Han creations, it means that we should not see miscellaneous texts as an exception to the norm. Excavated texts tell a different story than our Han bibliographers. As Martin Kern explains, no manuscript yielding tomb from late Warring States or early Han times can be identified with a specific philosophical lineage. The tomb occupants, presumably sponsors of some social stature, of the writings they were buried with, show widely eclectic interests. So perhaps being eclectic or syncretic was very common, even standard in the Warring States period. Take the case of the Lü Xu Qiunshu, or Master Lü's Spring and Autumn Annals. It is classified in the treatise as a syncretic text. It bears the name of Lü Buwei, prime minister of the Qin state before Qin established itself as the First Empire. He planned this text of encyclopedic proportions to educate and guide the ruler, the man who would become the first emperor. In view of Lü's aims, thinkers who worked with him synthesized views from a wide range of texts that we now see as aligned with the Confucian, Moist, legalist, and Taoist traditions. It was the most comprehensive compendium of its time, bringing together a vast number of topics, including the administration of government, cosmology, moral cultivation, technical knowledge, agriculture, music, rituals, and customs. The text consolidates ideas from earlier texts, and just as important, mentions exemplary actions and initiatives, as well as bad examples that are not to be followed. To describe the Lü Xu Qiunshu as syncretic would suggest that it is a large work cobbled together from disparate materials. But in light of its aim to inform and guide the ruler, it can instead be seen as having a coherent plan, with insights of the past harnessed to inform the present. It teaches the reader about timely and apt implementation of particular measures. So, the Lü Xu Qiunshu is not merely a repository of past wisdoms, but sought to enable the ruler to know to take appropriate action in response to circumstances. These are philosophically significant insights, and to approach it as a syncretic text could obscure the significance of this work in its contributions to epistemology and political philosophy. Of course, Han philosophical literature is not made up entirely of editions, histories, classifications, and compendiums. Thinkers proposed cosmological theses that underpin existence, further developed views on morality and politics, debated methods of argumentation, sought to understand the nature of language, and wrote books on women's education. As we cover all these topics and more in the coming episodes, we need to bear in mind how these debates grew from and built on the dynasty's project of unification. The ambition was to consolidate knowledge, intertwining it with political authority. As scholar Mark Lewis writes, such worlds created in writing provided models for the unprecedented enterprise of founding a world empire, and they underwrote the claims of authority of those who composed, sponsored, or interpreted them. One version of these texts ultimately became the first state canon of imperial China, and in this capacity it served to perpetuate the dream and the reality of the imperial system across the centuries. Just imagine what they could have accomplished if they'd known about podcasts, like this one, which will next time be delving further into Bangu, Sima Qian, and the philosophical relevance of Han historiography here on The History of Philosophy in China.